Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be cracking open the Book of Haggai.
Okay.
You know, a minor prophet, but with a major message. We've got some excerpts ready for you, and I have to say, this one's really got me thinking. 520 BC, Jerusalem, the Jewish people, were back from exile, ready to rebuild their temple, but things aren't exactly going as planned.
Yeah. What's so interesting here is that we're not talking about, logistical hurdles
Mm.
or enemy opposition.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about 16 years after returning. The foundation's laid, but the construction is stalled.
Mm-hmm.
And Haggai comes in with a divine message, and he's really pointing a finger right at the people's hearts.
Right. Okay, so I get that it's a wake-up call,
Yeah.
but I'm struggling a bit with this whole paneled houses imagery. It feels a bit outdated. Can you help me out here a little bit?
It's all about priorities, right?
Yeah.
He's not literally saying, no nice houses. It's about what we choose to invest in. Imagine these returning exiles, right?
Mhm.
They finally got some stability. They're building homes, getting comfortable. But God's house, the very symbol of their faith, is, well, it's in ruins,
Okay,
you know?
I see. So connecting that to today, couldn't our paneled houses be the time we spend scrolling through social media, getting lost in this digital world, instead of nurturing our spiritual lives?
Exactly. It's about those things we pour our energy and resources into, and often they're good things,
Mm-hmm.
but they eclipse what should be central.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't stop there. He connects this neglect to their economic woes, their uh, holes in the money bags, so to speak.
Yeah, when you said that, it made me think about how we sometimes compartmentalize our lives. Like, here's my faith, over here is work, and over there is my free time. But Haggai seems to be saying that it's all connected. Is that right?
Absolutely. This is where things get theologically interesting.
Okay.
Some might say, it's a simplistic obey and be blessed equation, but
Yeah.
maybe it's about alignment. When our priorities are in sync with God's,
Right.
there's a sense of wholeness, a flow to life, even when external circumstances are tough.
Hmm. I'm not sure I entirely agree. Couldn't it also be that sometimes bad things just happen? Faithful people struggle, experience loss, get hit with curveballs. How does Haggai account for that?
Yeah, you're right to push back on oversimplification.
Okay.
Haggai isn't giving us a formula for a problem-free life. He's pointing to a deeper reality.
Mm.
Our connection with God impacts everything.
Mm.
It's not about manipulating God for blessings, but recognizing that our choices have spiritual and, yes, sometimes even material consequences.
Okay, that's a really helpful distinction. So it's not that faith guarantees a perfect life, but that it gives us a different lens through which to view our experiences and make choices.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Haggai doesn't just leave the people with a rebuke.
Right.
He calls them to action. He wants to see that temple rebuilt.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is, they actually listen.
Seriously. After 16 years of procrastination, they suddenly snap out of it.
Yeah.
It feels a bit abrupt to me. What was it about Haggai's message that got through to them?
It's as if his words reawaken something in them. Maybe deep down they knew they were off track.
Yeah.
The text says that they respected the Lord again. So it wasn't just fear or duty. There's a sense of renewed relationship here.
Okay.
And it wasn't just willpower.
Right.
Haggai emphasizes that God was the one energizing them.
So it's like he gave them the courage to face those consequences we were talking about and to realign their priorities with God's.
Precisely. They were willing to step out in faith, even though they didn't know exactly how it would all work out. But then Haggai goes even further.
Okay.
He talks about this future glory for the temple, something that will surpass even Solomon's splendor.
Wait, are we talking about a literal building here, or is there something more to this?
That's where it gets really interesting. Haggai's words seem to point beyond bricks and mortar, towards something even grander.
All right, you've piqued my curiosity. We're going to need to unpack this further, but for now, let's take a quick break. Be sure to join us for part 2, where we'll delve deeper into these mysteries and messages of Haggai.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Haggai. We were just starting to unpack this idea of the temple's future glory surpassing even Solomon's. It feels like there's a lot more to this than just a fancy building.
Right. You're picking up on something crucial there. Remember, the temple wasn't just a place of worship. It represented God's presence dwelling among his people.
Right.
So when Haggai speaks of future glory, it's about something deeper, a spiritual reality that transcends the physical structure.
Okay, so less about gold and grandeur and more about
Yeah.
You said divine presence, but how does that connect to the everyday lives of those struggling to rebuild? You know what I mean?
Think about it. These people had just returned from exile, right?
Right.
They'd seen their nation shattered, their temple destroyed, their faith shaken.
Haggai's message isn't just, build it and God will bless you. It's a reminder that even in the midst of rebuilding their lives, God's presence is the ultimate source of hope and restoration.
So even though they're surrounded by rubble, both literally and figuratively, Haggai's giving them a glimpse of something bigger, something that points beyond their immediate circumstances.
Exactly. And this ties into that intriguing prophecy about Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah. Haggai calls him God's chosen and compares him to a signet ring.
Mm,
Remember, a signet ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a mark of authority,
right.
used to seal important documents,
Yeah.
representing the king's power and approval.
Hold on. If Zerubbabel was descended from a cursed line, how can he be the chosen one? Is Haggai contradicting God?
That's the beauty of prophecy. It often operates on multiple levels.
Okay.
On the surface, it seems like a contradiction. But if we dig deeper, we see that Haggai may be pointing toward a different kind of kingship, one that transcends earthly power structures.
So maybe Haggai is foreshadowing a future leader, a Messiah, who will ultimately embody that spiritual authority. But wasn't Zerubbabel just an ordinary guy trying to get a building project done? How does that make him a Messianic prototype?
Think back to King Hezekiah.
Okay.
Faced with the Assyrian threat, he didn't rely on military might alone.
Right.
He turned to prayer, seeking God's guidance. His signet ring, bearing the inscription, "Though the fig tree does not bud," symbolized his unwavering faith even in the face of uncertainty.
Wow, that's a great illustration.
Yeah.
So Zerubbabel, like Hezekiah, embodies a kind of leadership that prioritizes God's will above all else. But he never actually became a king in the traditional sense.
True, but maybe Haggai is hinting at something more profound. Remember those messianic expectations?
Yeah.
The Jewish people longed for a leader who would restore their kingdom, deliver them from oppression, and usher in an era of peace and prosperity.
Right, like a political and military superstar.
But what if Haggai is pointing toward a different kind of deliverance? A spiritual restoration that goes beyond earthly power.
So Zerubbabel, in his role as governor, rebuilding the temple, foreshadows a different kind of leadership, one that's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. That's a pretty bold claim.
It's definitely a thought-provoking interpretation, and it's not without precedent. Throughout the Old Testament, we see these glimpses of a future Messiah, figures who embody aspects of his character and mission.
Okay, so it's like we're piecing together a puzzle with threads connecting Zerubbabel, Haggai's prophecy, and ultimately Jesus. But I have to admit, it's a bit overwhelming to think about applying these ancient prophecies to our lives today. It feels so grand, you know?
That's understandable, but remember what we talked about earlier, alignment. It's not about perfectly mimicking Zerubbabel or waiting for a political savior. It's about aligning our hearts and priorities with God's will, seeking his guidance in the everyday stuff, trusting that he's working behind the scenes even when we can't see the whole picture.
So even though we're not rebuilding a physical temple, we can still learn from Haggai's message about the importance of spiritual foundations, seeking God's presence, and trusting his guidance. It's about rebuilding those temples in our own lives.
Exactly. But before we get too comfortable with this idea of rebuilding, Haggai throws in a curveball. Shaking. And I'm not just talking about a little tremor.
Yeah, the way he describes it is pretty intense. I will once again shake the sky and the earth, the sea and the dry ground. I will also shake up all the nations. It sounds almost apocalyptic.
It's definitely meant to get our attention. But the shaking isn't just about destruction. It's about purification,
Yeah.
about making way for something new. Haggai says that after the shaking, the treasures of all nations will be brought in, and I will fill this house with glory. It's like he's saying, hold on tight, because things are about to get interesting.
Okay, but what does that mean for us today? Is God literally going to shake the earth? Or is this some kind of metaphorical earthquake?
That's where we need to connect these ancient prophecies to our current reality. What are the nations and kingdoms that need shaking up today? What are the things we're clinging to that might be hindering God's purposes?
Oh, that's a good question. We could be talking about political systems, social structures, even our own personal belief systems. Anything that's built on a foundation of pride, greed, or self-reliance could probably use a good shakeup.
Exactly. And the shaking might not always be comfortable.
Right.
It might involve loss, upheaval, or even a sense of disorientation. But it's ultimately a process of refinement, of stripping away what's not essential so that we can stand firm on what's true and lasting.
So it's not about fearing the shaking, but about recognizing it as a necessary part of growth and transformation. It's about letting go of what's holding us back from God's best for our lives.
Exactly. And Haggai's message reminds us that even in the midst of shaking, God is still in control.
Mm-hmm.
He's not just sitting back and watching the world fall apart.
Right.
He's actively working to bring about his purposes, even if those purposes seem mysterious or even painful in the moment.
This is getting pretty deep. We've explored the idea of Zerubbabel as a messianic prototype, connected Haggai's prophecies to our lives today, and even touched on the concept of shaking. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I wanted to ask you about. Holiness.
Ah, yes. Haggai doesn't shy away from challenging the people's understanding of holiness.
Yeah.
In fact, he uses a rather unusual object lesson to drive home his point. Remember that conversation he has with the priests about holy meat and uncleanness?
Yeah, it seemed a bit random at first. Why bring up something as mundane as food preparation in the middle of this grand prophecy about rebuilding the temple?
Haggai is a master of using everyday examples to illustrate profound spiritual truths. He's asking the priests these specific questions to highlight a crucial point.
Yeah.
Our spiritual state affects everything we do.
Okay, walk me through this. What's the connection between holy meat and, like, our spiritual lives?
Imagine this. You're carrying holy meat, something set apart for God, and it touches something ordinary, like bread or oil. Does that ordinary thing suddenly become holy? The priests answer, no.
Right. That makes sense. You can't just transfer holiness like that.
But then Haggai flips the script.
Yeah.
He asks, what if someone ritually unclean, say from touching a dead body, touches these same items?
Yeah.
Do they become unclean? And the priests say, yes.
So uncleanness is contagious, but holiness isn't. That seems a bit unfair.
Haggai isn't talking about fairness. He's talking about the reality of sin and its impact on our lives. He's saying that our spiritual state, our uncleanness due to neglecting God and his priorities, can contaminate everything we touch, even our attempts at worship and service.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It's like he's saying, you can't just go through the motions of religion while ignoring the state of your heart. It all matters.
Exactly. And this leads us to another critical point, the need for repentance and renewal. Haggai isn't just pointing out their flaws.
Yeah.
He's calling them to turn back to God, to realign their hearts with his will.
So it's not about achieving some kind of perfect holiness, but about recognizing our need for God's grace and forgiveness, about continually returning to him even when we mess up.
Precisely. And Haggai assures the people that when they turn back to God, he will respond with blessing. Remember that passage where he tells them to consider their ways?
Yeah.
He points out that they've been struggling, their harvests have been meager, but from that day forward, God will bless them.
So it's like a turning point, a shift from judgment to grace. It's a reminder that even when we've messed up, God is always ready to receive us back and pour out his blessings on us.
Exactly. But those blessings might not always look like we expect. Remember, Haggai's prophecy pointed toward a future glory that went beyond material prosperity.
Right.
It was about the restoration of God's presence, a spiritual reality that ultimately finds its fulfillment in Jesus.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today. We've explored the depths of Haggai's prophecy, from the rebuilding of the temple to the concept of shaking and the importance of spiritual alignment. It's clear that this short book has a lot to say to us, even thousands of years later.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope it's inspired you to delve deeper into Haggai for yourselves.
Absolutely. But for now, let's take another quick break. We'll be back soon to wrap up our deep dive into Haggai.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been unpacking this book of Haggai, and I have to say this one's really challenged my thinking. We left off talking about holiness and how our spiritual state can really impact every area of our lives. It's not just about outward actions, but about aligning our hearts with God's will.
And that alignment or misalignment plays directly into that concept of shaking that we, touched on earlier.
Haggai's prophecy isn't just about a physical earthquake, though that imagery is powerful. It's about those times when God disrupts our comfortable routines.
Yeah.
Those systems we think are unshakable and forces us to reevaluate, what we're building our lives on.
When I think about shaking, my mind immediately jumps to current events.
Yeah.
There's so much uncertainty in the world right now. Political divisions, economic instability, climate change. It feels like the ground is constantly shifting beneath our feet.
That's a great connection. And it makes Haggai's message all the more relevant. He's not just speaking to a group of exiles rebuilding a temple. He's speaking to anyone who's ever felt the ground shake beneath their feet, anyone who's ever questioned their foundations.
So how do we make sense of this shaking, both personally and, like, on a global scale? Is it something to be feared, or is it an opportunity for growth?
Well, Haggai presents shaking as both a judgment and, like, a refining fire. It's a wake-up call, a challenge to examine what we're holding on to that might not be aligned with God's purposes. But it's also an opportunity to let go of what's holding us back, to make room for something new, something better.
It's like that saying, sometimes you have to lose everything to gain everything.
Right.
But it's so hard to let go, especially when we feel like we're clinging to things for, like, security or stability.
Absolutely. But Haggai reminds us that true security isn't found in, like, our possessions, our achievements, or even our own strength. It's found in our relationship with God and aligning ourselves with His will and trusting that He's working all things together for good.
Okay, so we've talked about prioritizing God, recognizing the consequences of spiritual neglect, and even embracing shaking as a process of refinement. But honestly, it all feels a bit daunting. Where do we even begin to apply these concepts in our everyday lives?
Start small. Remember those returning exiles?
Yeah.
They didn't rebuild the temple
Yeah.
overnight. They took one step at a time, trusting that God would guide the process.
So maybe it's about asking ourselves those questions we've been discussing, like, what are we prioritizing above God? What, uh, what temples in our lives need rebuilding? What are we clinging to that might need shaking loose?
Exactly. And don't be afraid to seek guidance from God.
Mhm.
He's not a distant deity who sets things in motion and then steps back. He's actively involved in our lives, guiding us, empowering us, and working all things together for our good.
It's encouraging to remember that we're not alone in this journey, you know? We have God's presence, His guidance, and His strength to draw upon. And even when we stumble or fall short, He's always ready to receive us back and help us get back on track.
And as we align ourselves with His will, we become part of something bigger than ourselves.
Right?
We become part of His story, a story of redemption and restoration that culminates in His ultimate victory over sin and death.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. So even amidst the shakings and uncertainties of life, we can hold on to the hope that God is working all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose.
Precisely. And that's a hope worth clinging to no matter what challenges we may face.
This deep dive into Haggai has been truly insightful. We've uncovered so much about the importance of prioritizing God, embracing shaking, and aligning our hearts with His will. It's a message that's as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago.
It's been a privilege to share this journey with you. I hope it's inspired you to take a deeper look at the Book of Haggai for yourselves.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you? What temples in your life might need rebuilding? Until next time, keep diving deep.